Chapter 3. Dakota. When Dakota opened her eyes, she glanced around, as the trees passed as if she had been riding in a car and woke from a long trip. Dakota's body moved because someone was carrying her through the forest. She watched as the landscape changed. Now she's headed down a hill into another valley, and being transported away from the sound of the waterfall, and the sound of the ocean which appeared to be far away. Her eyes focused on who the arms belonged to as she bounced up and down. Ronan's powerful arms cradled her, providing warmth from the cold. As Dakota's eyes glanced up at him, her beautiful innocent face fascinated him and made him shiver with need. Something inside him pulled at his groin. This had never happened before. No other females brought out the wolf in him, and the need for a female like this human. A weak, innocently looking female who didn't seem to get enough sleep, who couldn't make her way through a forest without getting lost, a girl who couldn't hunt or prepare food had managed to capture his heart. Who was she, and why was he feeling aroused and fascinated with her? Looking down at her small, undernourished body and her large eyes and beautiful mouth, his cock twitched with need. But now wasn't the time to feel this way. He had to get her back to his compound where she would be protected, and he had to convince his pack that she was worthy of being among them and she would never divulge their secret. "Where are you taking me?" Dakota's voice, suddenly strong and filled with anxiety. "We're going to my home in the forest. It's close." He thought Dakota understood why they could no longer stay in the cave. For her sake as well as the pack's. "You can't do that," she said, not knowing if she could trust him, and if he knew her secret, there was no way he would trust her. He would probably kill her after hearing that she had slept with a vampire and his feared adversary. Dakota didn't know it, but Ronan had marked her as his, and he intended to claim her when the time was right. Now Dakota had 3 males competing for her, and there wasn't enough for one to claim her, let alone 3. "What do you mean? I can do what I wish. I'm an alpha, and I'm the leader of my pack. No one dare question me. Besides, you will not live past tomorrow without me." "But you are bringing me too far from the ocean. How will I get home?" "Let me worry about that. When it's time, I'll bring you to Seattle. But now you're in my care, and I don't want anything to happen to you." "How is it that you know I'm from Seattle?" "We get visitors here from Seattle all the time. You're not a vampire, and I heard you talk in your sleep. The humans that venture here never make it into our valley. It's too steep a climb, and if they go too far, well, the vampires take care of that for us. Like the vampires, we too bring our young here to teach them to hunt. My pack owns half of this island. This is our hunting season. Soon it will be our mating season." "You hunt like the vampires? How is it you can exist in the same place?" "As I said before, we don't bother them, and they don't bother us. We owned all this island once, and Morgan bought that summit from my father. My father was sick and old, and wanted to preserve this piece of land for his children and their children and the pack. Morgan was a doctor who claimed to be a preservationist, but he lied to my father. My brothers and pack discovered he lied when our game began dying. Some of the pack had been poisoned by their venom because when the werewolves ate the deer bitten by vampires, who couldn't find enough humans as subjects, so they took to draining the deer of their blood instead of killing them." Dakota had heard enough. "You can put me down," Dakota said. Ronan stopped and placed her on her feet. She looked around to get her bearings, but there was nothing she could recognize. Sleeping through most of the journey had confused her. The thick wooded area and trails and streams told her nothing of where she was and how far she had traveled. She had never been keen on hiking when her parents suggested it for a family vacation, but now she wished she had. "Don't think about running away. You will never make it. One of our young werewolves may find you and take you for one of those vampires." "It's daylight," Dakota said obstinately. "How could they think I'm a vampire?" "Because you aren't a werewolf. When the pups are that young, they don't know the difference and they don't care. You look like food to them, or worse, a human who's been bitten. Dakota stared up at Ronan, and then started down the trail ahead of Ronan. You're going the wrong way, he yelled. Dakota turned with a sour look on her face, and mumbled something Ronan had heard from his mother. He barked out a small laugh, and pointed to the right path for her to take. Dakota turned abruptly around, and stumbled down the trail. That route you were on leads to the other side, and it will take you to that hilltop house. Ronan pointed to an enormous house setting near the top of a huge mountain. If you're headed to see Morgan and you want to be a vampire, then continue on that path. Ronan pointed his hand to another harmless-looking carved path with the grass and trees stripped away. As if someone cut away the vegetation to make it easy for somebody to get lost and end up in the vampire's estate. Dakota stopped and turned with her eyes wide, her expression frantic, and rushed back to Ronan's side. He grabbed her hand and she clutched his. The feeling he derived from her touch, as if heat had been blasted through his veins and the hair on his neck stood. Could she be the one his father and mother had warned him about? The one female who would render him weak because he needed to have her and make her his own. She couldn't be, he tried to tell himself. Dakota was too thin for him to consider her for a mate. The pack would never accept her. They had been walking an hour when Dakota said, I need to rest. We don't have much time before twilight, and you don't want me to carry you. Ronan enjoyed carrying around the little human. He felt his cock stir when she was in his arms. He couldn't wait until she agreed to become his mate. All this was so new and exciting that he couldn't contain his joy. The full moon came and left twice since he became a yearling, and still he hadn't chosen a mate or had the pleasure of bending her over and taking what he desired. He knew he couldn't treat this human like the were females. The were females understood that this was their way of mating and having the protection of the werewolf who claimed them, but not this feisty little human. He had to take it slow. Much too slow to his liking. But Dakota was the one Ronan wanted and desired. He would have to tell the other were females that he couldn't choose any of them. It would make them angry, but they would find another, was his thinking. He bought into the idea that all he had to do was to tell the pack that he had chosen the one who would make him happy and bear him strong pups. It became apparent when he lay near Dakota in the cold cave and brought her body to his to warm her. She hadn't seen the wolf in him. She hadn't seen his enormous length. He hadn't thought that through. He had to prepare her somehow. Dakota didn't know that Ronan had to claim her during the full moon and make her his, or one of the other werewolves would dare to challenge him for her if he wavered on his affections toward her. With the full moon nearing, when all were females would be vulnerable to a werewolf's advances, and would yield to the male's desires if they wanted his protection when they gave birth, they had few choices. They had to declare who they chose to mount them, even if the werewolves had more than one female. The females waited anxiously for that night of the full moon, in hopes they were chosen by an alpha. So why wasn't Dakota grateful and content to be his mate? Ronan thought. Because she belonged to a vampire, and she had mated with him first. But Ronan didn't know that, as he tramped eagerly into his valley, with Dakota keeping close behind. We're entering our compound now, Ronan said. Dakota looked around at its beauty and the splendor of the high trees and vegetation. She heard birds signing, which wasn't evident from where she had come from near the ocean. Not even a seagull flew or marshbird trod near. The area was gated off like a large compound you would find in any gated community in Seattle or any large city, but it was highly unusual to see it stuck in the middle of a valley with mountains and rivers surrounding it and the Pacific Ocean near. I didn't expect this, she said as Ronan keyed in the code. What did you expect? A bunch of huts and caves. Remember, werewolves are half human and half wolves. We come here as a retreat from the outside world and to be who we are, wolves. It is a respite from being human. We carry on our lives living among humans, being humans, talking and walking like humans and dressing in those ridiculous suits like humans, but not letting them know that we are werewolves. If they knew the difference, they would hunt us to extinction. The vampires see us as a threat. We're human, but not really. We walk during the day and night. If we wanted, we could hunt and kill the vampires. But since there are so few of us and more of them, it would take years and at our peril, Ronan said. Looking back at Dakota and she looking as if she couldn't take another step, Ronan asked, "Do you want me to carry you, or do you want to walk the rest of the way?" "If I were you, I wouldn't let the females see me carrying you." Dakota glanced up with tired eyes, trying to catch her breath. "Give me a few more minutes. I look terrible." She bent and put her hands on her knees to catch her breath. Ronan let out a small laugh. "You look beautiful to me." "Whose quarters are those?" Dakota said, pointing to the houses that looked like rows of townhomes. "They belong to the single females, and next to them are the single males, and those belong to the ones who are mated and have families. We have a group of homes for the betas, and then there is the one for the alphas." As the werewolves and were-females Ronan and Dakota carefully as they passed, you could see the flashing of eyes as they walked down the path. Their eyes became more noticeable because of twilight settling in. And who lives in that one, at the middle of that circle? The large stately one. The house that looks like it could belong to the leader or king, or whatever you call him. "That one belongs to me. My father and mother are no longer alive, and I'm now the alpha of the pack. One of my brothers is in charge when I'm away. He has a family, and I couldn't risk him leaving them, and because, as I said before, I have no family, and I have no female mate." It was that look on his handsome face that caught Dakota by surprise. He couldn't be thinking about what she was thinking. There was no way she could live with a werewolf out here. She was a city girl, and why would that laughable idea cross her mind? "You did say there were some females promised to you." Ronan didn't answer. He appeared to be occupied with his thoughts as he opened the door to the home. Dakota walked in. "Oh wow. This is beautiful." The large room was filled with windows all around it, and a high ceiling with oak beams running across. Dakota strode through the room, picking up pictures and staring at them. The furniture was sparse but expensive leather sofa and chairs set in front of a large stone fireplace. "That's my 3 brothers with my parents and me. My sister is the tiny one on the side of my mother." Dakota turned to him with the picture. "We had a small family. My brother Sidney lives at the compound year-round. He has a large family and too many mates. He takes care of the grounds. Nicholas is here," he pointed as he called their names. "He's here, you'll meet him, and Dylan eventually. Dylan and I live in Seattle. My sister Shay is no longer with us." Dakota raised her eyes in a sad gesture, thinking that Shay had died of something. "She married a human and lives in San Francisco. I don't see her much." Dakota thought he would say that she had been eaten by some animal, or worse, a vampire carried her off. Turning to Dakota, thinking he may have revealed too much to her about his family, he said, "My mother decorated this house before she died. But my female will have the honor of decorating it for us." He glanced at Dakota with a warm smile and a gleam flickering in his eyes. Turning away from him, feeling nervous, Dakota had seen the change in Ronan and the change in his eyes, from colors from dark to light brown. Dakota had an unsettling feeling that he was talking about her, and she would play a part somewhere in his life. But she couldn't. She belonged to Ashton, and somehow and sometimes she had to tell Ronan before this went too far, but today wasn't the day. "Can you show me to a room where I can shower?" She looked down at her clothes. "I'm afraid I don't have anything to change into." "Come with me." He took her hand, and when he stopped he said, "This room is yours. It has its own bathroom. You can feel comfortable, that you will not be disturbed by anyone. It was my mother's room. She has clothes you can fit into. She was a small woman like yourself. She would be happy to know that her clothes went too." Ronan stopped and didn't continue. Whose room is that? It was my father's room. It's mine now. They didn't sleep together? On the contrary. My father and mother always slept together. My mother needed a room when my alpha father became too overbearing. Werewolves are like that with females, and especially during the full moon. Ronan glanced at Dakota with a small closed smile. But my mother would put him in check, and he liked that she was strong enough to control him and tell him the truth when it became necessary. Humans are like that also, Dakota said, smiling and wondering when Ronan would leave so she could climb into the hot shower. It had been a long day, and if Dakota remembered correctly, it had been a terrifying week. Lost Thomas, lost Paige, and probably lost Ashton, and now she has this werewolf falling in love with her. She hadn't experienced this before. Men her age had never found her attractive, and that's why she never had a real date. She never wanted to put herself out there to be hurt. And when she fell in love with Ashton, she thought she would have him forever. Even as complicated as their relationship appeared to be, it was better than none at all, or was it? The water in the shower fell on her as she washed the dirt and mud from her hair and face. Dakota felt as if she had lost 50 pounds and she had with that filth on her body, and how could this werewolf want her the way she looked? He must be desperate, she thought. Ronan wasn't desperate. With his good looks and his position as an alpha, and he was rich, human females and females had their eyes on him, but his eyes were only for Dakota. Chapter 4. Ashton. What is it, Ashton? Why have you come to me now? Morgan turned to see Ashton standing. His body rigid, his fist curled tight, as he gazed out the window into the endless darkness. No lights were surrounding the property, set high on the top of the mountain overlooking the vast Pacific Ocean. His eyes marked patterns of schools of fish on the surface of the endless dark water. There was no need for lighting. Morgan saw light as a terrible nuisance. One more thing to remind him that he wasn't wholly immortal. One ray of the sun could reduce him to ashes where he would no longer exist. No longer carry out his desires. And his only wishes were to live like a vampire, with all the excesses afforded him. Humans to satisfy his cravings for blood, humans, men and women, to satiate his endless desire to dominate them sexually. Morgan enjoyed his state of being. He enjoyed the power he appeared to have over mankind as he leapt through the night, taking what he will, and the endless supply of food and pleasure. And now standing before him, Ashton, who threatened that balance of power. Strolling behind Ashton, Morgan slanted his head to the left, stretched, and crossed his arms. Ashton didn't react to Morgan's invading of his space. Ashton stood like a marble statue. You certainly aren't here to hunt, Ashton. I understand from Elizabeth that you no longer crave the taste of human blood, or her. Then tell me, Ashton, why have you come here? Ashton spun quickly around to look into Morgan's steel eyes, but Ashton said nothing. He had been passive-aggressive and quiet in Morgan's presence. Intimidated by Morgan, but not to the point where Morgan would recognize that in Ashton. Ashton knew his instincts, and physical strength was different than Morgan's now that he no longer fed on human blood. Because Ashton relinquished the drinking of human blood for animal blood, he no longer possessed the killer strength to meet Morgan and defeat him, and he recognized it long before Morgan would. Yet he came anyway. He came for Dakota. Nothing and no one would separate him from Dakota. She was his future and his life. However, Morgan didn't know all of Ashton's weaknesses, but he did know that one which involved Dakota. Perhaps that's why Morgan sent Elizabeth as a messenger. He thought Ashton still possessed the desire for Elizabeth's body. All Ashton had to do was survive this meeting and survive long enough to find the cure he had been searching for a century, and he could defeat Morgan. Morgan wouldn't dare challenge him for Dakota then. I'm returning to Seattle, Morgan said with a smirk, tomorrow night to be exact, but you're welcome to stay and hunt deer. Rest and take the whole week. You look tired. Am I casa, Sukasa? Ashton raised an eyebrow. He saw nothing amusing about what Morgan said. They were never brothers in the true sense. Never bonded as children. When Morgan found out about Ashton, he tried to kill him, and the nuns moved him through the forest for safekeeping. When Morgan took a step, he turned and said, "The deer population is increasing more than that werewolf population. Do me a favor and curtail it, will you?" Morgan waggled his eyebrow and gave out a loud laugh. Ashton turned to look at Morgan, only hearing him now. Werewolves. He had forgotten about them. Morgan purchased a portion of the island because he was able to fool a sick old alpha to sell some of the lands as a wildlife reserve, and Morgan claimed that it would help save the endangered wolves who inhabited it. Both the vampire and werewolves misrepresented themselves. Neither were men or humanitarians. Thief from thief makes God laugh, Ashton thought. This is their island after all, Ashton said to Morgan. Ashton moved closer, Morgan invading Morgan's space and testing him. Then he turned his back to Morgan once more to see what Morgan saw, as he stood above everyone on that island. The view spectacular, and the mountaintop afforded Morgan the high ground, and if it was any other brother or anyone else, he might have accepted the offer to remain for a week. "You know why I came, Morgan. You wanted to see me, and you mentioned Dakota. You sent Elizabeth to me, but her charms and what she represents hold no power over me anymore. I have the female who I desire. I've bonded with her." "Do you really?" "And listen to yourself. In your quest to discover the cure, you sound and think like a human." Morgan barked out a low grunt. Ashton turned quickly at Morgan's voice, and the closeness of his body almost made Ashton become unhinged, but this was the wrong place for a confrontation. "You actually think you have her?" There was a meaning in Morgan's words that Ashton didn't understand. Yes, Ashton knew of Morgan's desire for everything he possessed. But Morgan didn't know one thing, and that Ashton would kill anyone and anything, even a brother, to protect Dakota. "Make yourself clear, Morgan, what are you talking about?" "She's not here, and I don't have her, if that's what you're thinking. But she came here looking for her friends. Why wouldn't she be on this island?" "I have Paige, but her other friend is headed back to Seattle. I'm not giving Paige back. I let Dakota's human friend live. I didn't want Dakota to think that I was utterly heartless. Paige is a great little sub. I can bleed her at will and keep her like that for years. I will not let you have her to appease Dakota. And I will have Dakota in the end anyway. You're not strong enough to give battle, or close enough to your cure to ever defeat me. As long as you suck on those weak animals who eat nothing but grass, you will forever be what you are. A poor excuse for a vampire. A weak, lovesick vampire who can be led by the smell of a human's pussy." Ashton didn't react to Morgan's words. He stood hard without response, but every part of him was whirling in rage. "It's getting light outside, Ashton. You took too long to get here. I offer you a place to sleep, because you will not make it back to Seattle in time, or to your yacht, or that cellar you call an apartment. See how I take care of my younger brother. I offer you a refuge from the sun. And I offer you Elizabeth as your sub once again. If you don't trust sleeping in my place, then you can face the sun, and I will have won without a challenge, and oh how I love a challenge. Live long enough where I can defeat you, and watch you lose everything that matters to you." Morgan stood emotionless, not smirking and not scowling. Just looking into Ashton's eyes and waiting for an answer. Reluctantly, Ashton said, "I'll take your offer, but without Elizabeth." "Oh, but the offer comes with Elizabeth. You wouldn't give her to me when you had her, but see how gracious I am. I give her willingly to you, my brother, my guest, to enjoy her beautiful ass. I've had endless hours using it. But I've moved on. Elizabeth is a dominant who is a switch. She needs what I can no longer give her." Morgan extended his open hands toward Ashton. "Make up your mind. The vaults will be sealed before the sun rises and will not open until twilight. What choice did Ashton have? He never wanted to be tempted by Elizabeth again. He had left that sinful lifestyle of vampire dom for what he sought now. A way to live without the constant need for human blood and sex. And now he would be locked up with Elizabeth all day. Tempted by their past. How could he sleep and amass enough energy to search for Dakota, if Elizabeth would be there to entice him, to arouse his base instincts, and sap him of that little energy and self-control he had left? It was what Morgan and Elizabeth hoped for all along, and he fell into their trap. Morgan had one thing in mind, and that was to undermine his relationship with Dakota, and make him vulnerable to the lure of his vampire life before her. When Ashton and the vampires lined up to take their concubines and food supply with them into the vaults beneath the stone mansion, Dakota was stepping out of the shower into Ronan's mother's room. The doors to the vaults closed one at a time. The darkness didn't affect Ashton. He could see perfectly. Because standing with a studded collar on her neck, and her body naked but for the strips of black leather and studs, attracting Ashton's eyes, and Elizabeth standing before Ashton waiting for his instructions. Elizabeth, beautiful and pale young-looking woman, strode out of the shadows of the dark corner and came near to Ashton. Her hard breasts and nipples touched Ashton's skin, and it heightened his need. His cock twitched because of her closeness to him. Not because he felt anything for her, but because of the nature of the vampire body. Always craving sex, always craving blood. Always an endless merry-go-round of pleasure and need. I have no necessity for you, Elizabeth. Don't you know I don't want you anymore? She then kneeled at his feet with her hands behind her back and lowered her head. Get up, he said, his voice harsh and strong. I don't want this. But Elizabeth remained in her position. Why can't you forget me? I thought you were happy with Morgan. I am happy with Morgan, but I need to serve both of you. And I will never forgive you for not making me a vampire. We could have ruled the world together with me serving you. I could have hunted for our food. And the sex was more than I ever experienced. Now it's even better. All you have to do is claim me once more, and I can serve you and Morgan. She rose once she watched Ashton lay on the stone bed draped with white satin cloth. Tell me what you want, Elizabeth said as she brushed her hand along his leg. His skin didn't respond as it did when Dakota touched him. Dakota's touch made his dead cock come to life in ways it hadn't in 100 years, full, ripe and needy. Elizabeth repulsed Ashton, but then that's what he enjoyed about her after she introduced him to her way of life. He abused her body in every possible way, and still she cried for more. As a vampire he didn't know his strength, he only knew his needs, and with sex and food it was boundless. I want nothing of you or from you, Ashton said, closing his eyes, trying to resist the urges that had consumed his body and brought to life by his sex with Dakota. If only he hadn't had that sexual experience with Dakota, he would be able to resist Elizabeth. He tried being insufferable with Dakota, but couldn't maintain that for long. He desired her warmth and her heated opening, and no amount of abstaining from sex with her would keep him from wanting Dakota's beautiful young body. And because of that one lapse of judgment, he's confronted with the test of his life, and it could spell the end of his relationship with Dakota. Persisting while ignoring Ashton, Elizabeth placed her hand on Ashton's cock. At first he sprang with disgust. But Elizabeth wasn't discouraged. She knew him better than he knew himself. He detested her, but that would fuel his rage once she got him to fuck her, and that's all Elizabeth desired. When she first introduced him to her lifestyle and her sexual interludes with men and women, Ashton refused, and then he relented to her wants and his needs because his sexual needs turned into an addiction, and Elizabeth helped fuel his addiction. She thought she knew what Ashton needed. As their BDSM life became more dangerous and involved more humans, he became cold. The warmth she first felt from him wasn't what she was looking for. She could find that anywhere with any human. But what fascinated her was the idea that he was a vampire, and he could make love to her the way she desired, cold and violent. Her demands on him to use her body began to become second nature, and him coldly without feelings would strap her to benches, handcuff her to the bed, have her kneel by his side as he slept, and when he woke he would fuck her from behind for days. But she would never complain. That is what she needed from him and desired. It aroused her as much as it began to stimulate Ashton. Elizabeth had been his sub and served him, and taught him how to be a dom even as he rejected it. When he met her, all he wanted was a closeness to a human to make him feel more human, but instead, when Elizabeth introduced him to her life, it took him back to his time before he found love with a human. In Italy, she introduced him to underground clubs where they would spend their nights with humans only to bring them back to Ashton's apartment, where they both would engage in sex with men and women, and then afterward, Ashton would bleed them and discard them. Elizabeth was his partner in these criminal acts. But it wasn't enough for Elizabeth. She needed more. She helped Ashton to understand his power over men and other vampires. But since she left him and had been turned by Morgan, Ashton had lost that edge. He needed to be her dom again. She needed a dom more powerful than Morgan, because of his lost interest in her. Morgan would never admit it, but he was more of a sub than a dom, and he now sought out male dominance to change into vampires. Morgan's primary interest in Dakota was to hurt Ashton. Elizabeth thought if she could take Ashton back to his time with her, he would remember what he had enjoyed about their sexual life. Now was the time to remind Ashton of his powers over others, and remind him that he was a powerful vampire dom. She would never get another chance, and that's why being with him now was necessary. Elizabeth climbed on the bed-like structure, and kneeled between his legs with her arms behind her back. "What do you want, dom? How can I serve you? Say it." Her voice low and faded. No longer demanding. Ashton glanced down at Elizabeth perched between his legs. It didn't mean he didn't want Elizabeth to serve his needs. It only meant that he didn't want to admit that he had enjoyed her body once. He said nothing when she placed her mouth over his hard cock and let it slide down her throat. It filled her mouth, and she used her tongue to taste his pre-cum as her tongue glided around his slit. "Don't make me come. If you do, I will punish you as you have never been punished before." Her eyes lit up because that's all she wanted, was to be punished. For Ashton to use her up this day. Elizabeth's powerful jaws and mouth squeezed his cold hard penis to life and to bring forth his cum. The punishment was what she was hoping for. She knew what it meant to bring him to orgasm. She knew that as a vampire dom, Ashton could inflict severe punishment on her body, which would prevent her from being able to have sex again. If his cock was too hard, he could tear her genitals apart. She knew the punishment, yet she would risk it for one night and one more session with Ashton. It was worth the risk because if she succeeded, she would have him again and maybe forever. The feeling was intense that Elizabeth gave Ashton with her mouth, but he resisted as he came to the edge and pulled back. He gave out a moan as if in pain. He enjoyed her sucking his cock, but he didn't want to show his feelings, and he thought that if he didn't come in Elizabeth's mouth, he had been faithful to Dakota. "Stand and turn your back to me," Ashton said. His cock rose at the sight of her porcelain hard ass. Dressed in leather straps crisscrossing her breasts and back and waist where her buttocks were exposed, he had to hold his cock to stop his orgasm. He swiped his tongue across his bottom lip at the thought of what he had done once to her. Holding his length, he stepped to the floor. He had used both openings night and day when she was a human. The lure of her opening and ass had taken him back to when he was that other vampire. Cruel and hard and punishing. This is what Elizabeth wanted from him in Italy, and he had given it to her and then more. "Bend over in front of me with your back to me. I want to see you as I once saw you. I have no intentions of using you. Ever. I want you to use me in any way that would suit you, master," Elizabeth said. "I know you do, that's why I refuse to give in to your desires." It wasn't as much her desire as it was his to look at her beautiful hard body once more and be reminded of that other life. A life he no longer wanted, but deep in his soul craved. Elizabeth bent forward with her ass exposed to Ashton's eyes. She placed her hands behind and opened her cheeks. "What are you doing?" "I didn't ask you to do that," Ashton said, his voice desperate and urgent. She knew he didn't want her to expose that part of her. That part he had enjoyed with such abandonment. It was his weakness, and she knew it. She had been the one to introduce him to anal intercourse, and he had enjoyed it immensely. Too much. Ashton moved her closer to Elizabeth until his tented cock reached the slit in Elizabeth's ass. He stood salivating at the thought as he looked down on Elizabeth as she remained in a bent-forward position, her legs wide and her cheeks spread with her hand. She heard Ashton's breath quickened. She listened to his growl and watched when his head fell back and his mouth opened with a deep moan. And she knew he had held out as long as he could, and he couldn't resist her. She had accomplished her goals, and all that was needed was for Ashton to see what he had desired all those years ago. He slapped her ass and it made a dull hard sound. And she didn't move, and her ass didn't turn red as Ashton remembered. Because she was no longer that innocent young human who he met on the streets of Rome and introduced him to his dominant side. Too long he had spent in the libraries and had lost his human bride when he came across her. Too long it had been since he had been in that life, and he didn't want it anymore. He needed Dakota, but all he had now was the heightened sex drive of a vampire and the need to satisfy that desire. He didn't remember when he entered Elizabeth. He didn't remember if he had an orgasm. He didn't remember that day, because he wanted to forget everything he had committed on Elizabeth's body. When he woke, he lay alone, feeling empty. Where had that human part of him gone? It left with Dakota, and he had to get it back. But how, after he had been unfaithful?